Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. When the red flag of the Soviet Union was lowered over the Kremlin on the freezing night of December 25th, 1991, the empire did not simply die, it shattered. Among its fragments, Ukraine emerged as a newborn nation carrying the weapons of an empire. On its soil rested nearly 2,000 nuclear warheads, hundreds of intercontinental ballistic missiles, and strategic bombers capable of annihilating continents. For a brief moment in history, Kiev possessed more nuclear firepower than China, France, and the United Kingdom combined. Yet this inheritance was as dangerous as it was powerful. The world saw not stability, but catastrophe in waiting, a fragile state with the arsenal of a superpower. Washington and Moscow both pressed Ukraine to disarm, fearing a Yugoslavia with nukes. Crippled by hyperinflation and haunted by the ghost of Chernobyl, Ukraine faced an impossible choice: isolation with weapons or acceptance without them. Its leaders chose trust over fear, believing that in the New World Order, treaties could replace deterrence. In December 1994, Ukraine signed the Budapest Memorandum, surrendering every warhead in exchange for security assurances from Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. The language was deliberate: assurances, not guarantees, diplomatic words that would later echo like a curse. Western leaders celebrated a triumph of diplomacy. Moscow regained its monopoly on Soviet might. The world believed a page of history had been turned, but in truth, it had only been bookmarked. The following decades hardened the fractures within Ukraine's own identity. To the west of the Dnieper River, cities like Lviv and Ivano-Frankivsk turned toward Europe, drawn to open borders and the promise of the European Union. To the east, in Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea, factories and language tethered millions to Russia's orbit. Politics became a pendulum swinging between reformers and oligarchs, each exploiting the divide while corruption hollowed out the state from within. By 2010, the pendulum swung decisively toward Moscow. Viktor Yanukovych, a coarse politician from the Donbass, rose to the presidency. He was pragmatic, loyal to power more than ideology, and viewed by many as the Kremlin's man in Kyiv. Yet even he could not ignore that most Ukrainians longed for the prosperity of Europe. Negotiations began with Brussels for an association agreement, a bridge between the Soviet past and a European future. Then came the pressure. In 2013, as the deal neared signing, Moscow struck back with economic warfare. Russian customs blockaded Ukrainian exports, markets collapsed, and Putin offered a $15 billion bailout to keep Kiev in his orbit. Facing bankruptcy and dwindling support, Yanukovych yielded. On November 21, 2013, he abruptly suspended the European deal. It was a single decree, but it severed the illusion that Ukraine could balance between East and West. That night, under the Monument to Independence, a journalist's Facebook post summoned a few hundred students. They arrived carrying EU flags, candles, and thermoses of tea, believing they were gathering for a peaceful protest. Within days, the crowd grew into tens of thousands. They were young, unarmed, and defiant. Beneath the cold rain of Kyiv, they sang the national anthem and vowed that their country would never again be sold like a province of an empire. None of them knew it yet, but they had lit the first flame of a war that would define their century. What began as a gathering of students soon transformed into a fortress of defiance. By December, Kiev's Independence Square, Maidan Nezalezhnosti, had become a city within a city, surrounded by walls of snow, ice, and burning tires. Makeshift kitchens fed thousands. Field hospitals treated the wounded. Priests prayed between barricades of sandbags. It was no longer a protest about a trade agreement. It was a struggle for dignity, identity, and the right to choose a future not written in Moscow. The breaking point came before dawn on November 30th. The Berkut, Ukraine's notorious riot police, stormed the square to disperse the remaining students. What followed was not a crackdown, but a beating. Videos of armored officers clubbing teenagers beneath Christmas lights spread across social media within hours. By sunrise, the entire nation had seen it. The brutality broke an unspoken rule: corruption was tolerated, but violence against one's own children was not. 2 days later, 500,000 people flooded Kiev's streets. Winter deepened, and the Maidan hardened into a bastion of rebellion. Protesters built cathedrals of fire from burning tires, turning the heart of the capital into a vision from the apocalypse. The air smelled of gasoline and freedom. When Parliament passed the dictatorship laws in January, criminalizing helmets, masks, and public assembly, the crowd did not disperse. Instead, they forged shields from scrap metal and wore pots and construction hats for armor. In the smoke and snow, the line between medieval and modern blurred. Then came the blood. On January 22nd, Serhiy Nigoyan, a young Armenian Ukrainian, was shot and killed, the first martyr of the revolution. More followed. Snipers appeared on rooftops. Stun grenades echoed through the avenues. The protesters fought back with sticks and Molotov cocktails, singing the anthem as bullets cracked through the cold air. Journalists called it the Winter of Fire. For Ukrainians, it became the rebirth of a nation. February brought the storm's climax. On the 18th, riot police launched their final assault, setting the trade union building ablaze, the nerve center of the uprising. The city's central square became a battlefield. By the 20th, as protesters advanced up Institutska Street, government snipers opened fire. The images that followed seared themselves into global memory. Men falling with wooden shields in hand, priests blessing the dying, blood soaking the cobblestones of a European capital. In 48 hours, over 100 people were killed. The massacre shattered the regime. Yanukovych's allies defected. His security forces fled. On the night of February 21st, the president himself escaped the capital by helicopter, leaving behind a palace of grotesque luxury, private zoos, marble villas, and a golden loaf of bread. The next morning, Kiev's gates opened. Citizens wandered through his abandoned estate in disbelief, seeing with their own eyes what their stolen future had built. The Maidan stood victorious, but the air was thick with grief. The snow was black with ash, and candles flickered where the heavenly 100 had fallen. Ukraine had overthrown its ruler but inherited his chaos. While the people mourned their dead, in the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin watched in silence. To him, this was not a revolution. It was a Western coup against Russian influence. As Kiev celebrated its fragile freedom, the first Russian special forces were already on the move. The smoke had not yet cleared, but the next war had already begun. While Kiev mourned the fallen of Maidan, a quieter storm was already forming to the south. In the early hours of February 27, 2014, armed men in immaculate uniforms appeared in the streets of Simferopol, the capital of Crimea. They carried modern AK-74 rifles and moved with the discipline of professionals, but their uniforms bore no flags, no patches, no names. The locals called them Zelyonye Chelovechki, the Little Green Men. Both, without firing a shot, they seized Crimea's parliament and raised the Russian tricolor over the building. To the world, it was an enigma. To Moscow, it was a masterpiece of deception. Putin denied everything. He appeared on television with a slight smile, calling the massed troops local self-defense units. Yet the truth was plain to anyone who had seen a Russian soldier before. The weapons, the vehicles, even the manner of speech, they were all unmistakably Russian. But the ambiguity served its purpose. The West hesitated to call it an invasion, while Ukraine, reeling from revolution and without a functioning army, could only watch in disbelief. By the time the interim government realized the scale of the operation, Crimea was already surrounded by land, sea, and air. Inside the peninsula, Russian operatives moved swiftly to neutralize resistance. Ukrainian bases were cut off, communications jammed by electronic warfare systems. Commanders in Kiev issued a tragic order: hold your ground, but do not fire. The army was paralyzed by caution, afraid that one bullet could ignite a full-scale war it could not possibly win. Russian troops exploited this restraint with precision. They surrounded bases with civilians and so-called Cossack militias, using them as human shields while offering Ukrainian officers a cruel choice: defect and keep your rank, or leave with nothing. The betrayals came fast. Rear Admiral Denis Berezovsky, appointed head of the Ukrainian Navy just a day before, defected immediately, pledging allegiance to Crimea's new authorities. Across the peninsula, commanders followed. Some surrendered. Others locked themselves inside their bases, waiting for orders that would never come. Yet among the confusion, moments of defiance burned bright. At Belbek Air Base, Colonel Yuli Mamchur led his unarmed men toward the Russian lines, carrying the blue and yellow flag and singing the national anthem as warning shots cracked overhead. It was a futile gesture, but one that captured the moral heart of Ukraine's resistance. On March 16th, under the watch of armed men, Crimea held a so-called referendum. The ballot offered no real choice: join Russia or join Russia with autonomy. Official results claimed that 97% supported annexation, an absurd figure even by authoritarian standards. 2 days later, Putin signed the Treaty of Accession in Moscow's St. George's Hall. The audience applauded, the anthem thundered, and fireworks lit the sky over Red Square. Crimea was now part of the Russian Federation, at least on paper. The world's reaction was muted. The United States and European Union imposed limited sanctions, targeting a handful of officials and banks. Gas continued to flow westward. Trade continued almost untouched. For Putin, it was a revelation. He had redrawn Europe's borders without facing a single soldier from NATO. The lesson was intoxicating. Force worked, and the West would protest but not intervene. In a single month, Russia had gained a strategic jewel, a propaganda triumph, and a dangerous new confidence. But the victory contained the seed of the next war. In the industrial heartlands of eastern Ukraine, Russian television began to speak of fascists ruling Kyiv, of persecuted Russian speakers, of a new Novorossiya waiting to be liberated. The little green men had done their job. Now the fires of insurgency were being lit in the Donbass. Crimea was the rehearsal. The main act was about to begin. The takeover of Crimea had been silent, almost surgical. The war that followed in the Donbass would be anything but. It began not with an official declaration or the roll of tanks, but with the arrival of a few unmarked vans crossing Ukraine's eastern border on April 12, 2014. They stopped in the gray industrial town of Sloviansk. Out stepped men with Russian accents, disciplined movements, and combat gear far too advanced for local rebels. Their leader was Igor Girkin, known as Strelkov, a former FSB officer and veteran of Chechnya. Within hours, his men stormed the local police headquarters, seized the armory, and raised the Russian flag. The separatist war had begun. From Sloviansk, the contagion spread like wildfire. Across Donetsk and Luhansk, armed groups seized government buildings, police stations, and broadcasting towers. They called themselves People's Militias, fighting Kyiv's oppression, but their weapons and coordination betrayed their origin. Russia was orchestrating the rebellion from behind the curtain, flooding the region with fighters, money, and propaganda. Russian state television branded the new government in Kyiv as fascists and NATO puppets, sowing panic among locals already mistrustful of the West. The illusion of a grassroots uprising masked the birth of a Russian-backed insurgency. Kyiv, still disoriented after the revolution, had almost no army to respond. Decades of corruption had gutted its military. Soldiers lacked body armor, ammunition, even food. Out of 200,000 listed personnel, fewer than 6,000 were combat ready. With the state paralyzed, volunteers filled the void. Dozens of irregular units formed overnight: the Donbass Battalion, Dnipro 1, and the controversial Azov Regiment. Teachers, miners, and students took up rifles, vowing to defend the country's sovereignty with little more than determination and a handful of Soviet rifles. Kyiv labeled the campaign to retake the region the anti-terrorist operation, a bureaucratic name for a civil war spiraling out of control. The first clashes were chaotic. Ukrainian forces attempted to retake Sloviansk in April, but found themselves ambushed by disciplined fighters with heavy weaponry. Helicopters were shot down by Russian-supplied manpads. Convoys were surrounded by civilians acting as human shields. The line between war and theater blurred. Some towns welcomed the separatists, others resisted bitterly. By May, the fighting had escalated into artillery duels. The city of Kramatorsk was scarred by explosions. Its streets turned into front lines. The illusion of peace that had followed the fall of the Soviet Union was shattered. For the first time since 1945, European cities were under shell fire. In July, Ukrainian volunteer forces began regaining ground. They liberated Sloviansk and forced Gherkin's militia to retreat deeper into Donetsk. The victory lifted morale, but provoked the Kremlin's fury. Russian artillery began firing across the border, and convoys of humanitarian aid trucks rolled in, white-painted vehicles carrying weapons instead of food. The thin veil of deniability was slipping. Moscow could no longer hide its hand, and Kiev's fragile army was about to pay the price for standing alone. The Donbass War had begun as a shadow conflict, but it was becoming something larger, a test of will between two worlds. In the east, the tricolor of the Russian Federation fluttered above occupied city halls. In the west, Ukrainians sang their anthem beneath bullet-riddled flags. The front lines were still fluid, but the direction was clear. The age of illusions was over. Europe was watching a new kind of war, one fought with propaganda, volunteers, and deniable soldiers. And somewhere in the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin realized that the experiment was working. What he had tested in Crimea could now be scaled across a border that no longer seemed to exist. By midsummer 2014, the battlefield in eastern Ukraine had turned into a map of smoldering towns and shifting front lines. Against all odds, Ukraine's battered army, reinforced by volunteer battalions and fueled by a surge of national resolve, began pushing the separatists back toward the Russian border. Sloviansk and Kramatorsk were liberated, morale surged, and for the first time in months it seemed the tide was turning. Yet in Moscow, the Kremlin watched the advance with growing alarm. The collapse of its proxy forces would have been a humiliation Vladimir Putin could not afford. Then came the disaster that shocked the world. On July 17, 2014, a Malaysian Airlines Boeing 787 flight MH17 was cruising at 33,000 feet above the fields of Hrabov when it vanished from radar. A Buk surface-to-air missile, launched from separatist-held territory by a Russian-made system, tore through the aircraft mid-air. All 298 passengers, families, aid workers, children, were killed instantly. Their bodies and luggage rained down across sunflower fields already scarred by war. Within hours, the crash site was overrun by armed militants looting the wreckage, while Moscow flooded the airwaves with lies and counterclaims. The world saw through the smoke, and the tragedy became proof that the conflict was no longer local. It had gone global. The international outrage isolated Russia diplomatically, but on the ground, nothing stopped the fighting. Ukrainian forces pressed deeper into Donetsk and Luhansk, attempting to cut off separatist supply routes. The operation culminated at the railway hub of Ilovaisk, where Kyiv hoped to encircle the rebels and sever their link to the Russian border. In late August, Ukrainian battalions entered the city, only to find themselves walking into a trap. As they advanced, the Russian army crossed the frontier in force. Tanks, artillery, and elite airborne troops painted with improvised white circles for identification. The illusion of a local insurgency died the moment regular Russian units appeared on Ukrainian soil. For the next week, Ilovaisk became a cauldron of horror. Ukrainian troops were surrounded, bombarded from all sides, and cut off from supplies. They radioed for air support that never came. By August 29th, their ammunition was nearly gone, their dead unburied, and their wounded beyond evacuation. Under pressure from the international community, Putin called publicly for a humanitarian corridor to allow the trapped soldiers to withdraw. Kyiv's commanders, exhausted and desperate, agreed, trusting that even war had limits. At dawn the next day, columns of Ukrainian vehicles began to leave Ilovaisk, trucks loaded with the wounded, buses carrying prisoners, and jeeps marked with white flags. Then, as they crossed the open fields near Mnohopilia, the trap was sprung. Russian tanks and artillery opened fire from concealed positions, obliterating the convoy in minutes. The so-called Green Corridor became a killing field. Survivors described burning vehicles, screaming men crawling through the grass, and comrades executed as they tried to surrender. More than 360 Ukrainian soldiers were killed. Hundreds more were captured or left behind in shallow graves. Ilovaisk broke something deeper than morale. It shattered illusions. Ukraine could no longer call this a hybrid war or an insurgency. It was a full-scale invasion by its powerful neighbor. In Kyiv, Funerals filled the streets while volunteers lined up to enlist once again. The world issued condemnations, but no armies came. The Minsk ceasefire that followed in September froze the lines but not the wounds. For Russia, Ilovaisk was a brutal victory. For Ukraine, it was a baptism of fire that would define its modern identity. From that point forward, the question was no longer if there would be another war. It was only when. After Ilovaisk, the map of Ukraine hardened into a scar that refused to heal. In February 2015, Kiev and Moscow signed the Minsk II agreements under the pressure of Europe's diplomacy, hoping to end the bloodshed. But what emerged was not peace. It was paralysis. A jagged 450-kilometer front, known as the Line of Contact, carved its way through the Donbass, slicing through fields, backyards, and towns that had once been connected by family and trade. Artillery duels gave way to sniper wars, ambushes, and minefields. It was a ceasefire only on paper, a conflict frozen in form but still burning underneath. For soldiers on both sides, the years that followed became a grim routine of death by inches. Trenches filled with water in the spring and froze in the winter. Soldiers warmed their hands over tin can stoves, knowing the silence could break at any moment. Mortars, tripwires, and booby traps became the landscape of daily life. Civilians who refused to flee lived in basements without electricity or running water, crossing mined fields to fetch bread or pension payments. The war faded from Western headlines, but for those trapped in the gray zone, it was endless. The quiet war that everyone pretended had ended. Behind the front, Ukraine began to transform. The volunteer battalions of 2014 were absorbed into a restructured army. Western trainers arrived, Americans through Operation Fearless Guardian, Canadians through Operation Unifier, and British instructors through Operation Orbital, teaching NATO command tactics, communications, and logistics. By 2021, Ukraine's army was no longer the disorganized force of 2014. It was battle-hardened, professional, and equipped with Western-supplied javelins and counter-battery radars. The generation forged in the trenches understood their enemy intimately, because they had fought him in silence for years. Moscow, meanwhile, waged a different kind of war. Unable to conquer openly, Russia began to absorb the occupied Donbass in slow motion. Passports were distributed en masse. The ruble replaced the hryvnia. Russian television filled the airwaves with propaganda about Kiev's fascist junta. Schools taught Russian history, and conscription offices registered young men for the Russian army. It was annexation by paperwork, a creeping occupation designed to make reintegration impossible. For every weapon the West sent to Kyiv, Moscow sent 100 bureaucrats to erase Ukraine's presence from its own land. Outside observers called it a frozen conflict, but nothing about it was still. The front shifted slightly every month. Villages were captured and lost, and names like Marinka, Avdiivka, and Chirikine became synonyms for stalemate and ruin. The OCE monitored the explosions, counting them with bureaucratic precision. 1,000 violations in a week, then 2,000. But their reports changed nothing. The West grew tired of a war without progress. Politicians in Berlin and Paris spoke of compromise. Kiev called it betrayal. And so, year after year, the Donbass bled quietly into the earth. The soldiers rotated home with haunted eyes. Children learned to recognize the sound of incoming artillery by its whistle. Families rebuilt houses that would be shelled again the following winter. To outsiders, it seemed like the conflict had been contained, but those who lived along the line knew better. Wars in Eastern Europe do not end with signatures. They end when someone loses the strength to keep fighting. And by 2021, as Russian tanks began to mass once again along the border, the silence of the frozen front began to sound like a drumbeat. By the closing months of 2021, the quiet along the front had begun to feel unnatural. Satellites captured vast Russian formations assembling along Ukraine's borders, columns of tanks in Belgorod, artillery parks in Kursk, field hospitals in Belarus. Open-source analysts mapped every convoy in real time, posting satellite shots that looked like something out of a Cold War nightmare. To many, it still seemed impossible that war could return on such a scale. Yet the evidence piled higher every week. New pontoon bridges, blood plasma shipments, mobile crematoria. Armies don't prepare for peace with refrigerated trucks. Diplomacy raced to catch up. Western capitals demanded explanations. Moscow replied with ultimatums. In December, Putin delivered a list of security guarantees that read like a declaration of ownership. NATO must withdraw from Eastern Europe, Ukraine must be permanently barred from joining, and the alliance must roll back to its 1997 borders. It was an impossible demand crafted to be refused. The rejection, broadcast days later, gave the Kremlin its pretext. The final orders had already been written. Inside Ukraine, disbelief clashed with dread. The warnings from Washington sounded apocalyptic, but after 8 years of limited war, few could imagine tanks once again rolling toward Kiev. President Volodymyr Zelensky, fearing panic and economic collapse, urged calm, dismissing talk of invasion as Western exaggeration. Cafes stayed open, weddings were held, and people booked spring vacations. But in military circles, preparations accelerated quietly. Territorial defense drills in cities, sandbags stacked in basements, and emergency rations distributed in schools. It was as if the entire nation was bracing for an earthquake everyone knew was coming, but couldn't admit aloud. In Moscow, Putin surrounded himself with loyalists and ghosts from the KGB era. Intelligence briefings told him what he wanted to hear, that Ukraine's army was corrupt, its people divided, and its president weak. He believed his troops would be greeted as liberators. The operation, his generals promised, would last 3 days. Kiev would fall before the weekend. Russian soldiers packed parade uniforms alongside ammunition, expecting a swift victory march. Following them were riot police and mobile detention trucks, not for battle, but for occupation. As February approached, the warnings became unmistakable. Russian troops in Belarus drilled river crossings under the cover of exercises. Warships crowded the Black Sea. Cyber attacks crippled Ukrainian government networks, while Russian propaganda flooded social media with stories of genocide in the Donbass. At the United Nations, diplomats pleaded for restraint, even as missiles were being fueled hundreds of miles away. Then, in the early hours of February 24, 2022, the waiting ended. Vladimir Putin appeared on Russian television, his face expressionless, his voice low and deliberate. "I have decided to conduct a special military operation," he said, claiming it was to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Minutes later, the first cruise missiles streaked across the sky. Ukrainian radar screens filled with red dots. The age of frozen conflict was over. Europe was at war again. At 4:50 a.m. on February 24, 2022, the night sky above Ukraine erupted in fire. Dozens of Russian cruise missiles tore through the air, their engines shrieking as they streaked toward radar stations, airports, and ammunition depots from Lviv to Kharkiv. The horizon glowed white as explosions rippled across the countryside, shattering windows in Kyiv and sending car alarms screaming through the darkness. People awoke to their phones vibrating with the same message. "It's begun." The illusion of post-Cold War stability collapsed in a single moment. Europe had not seen an invasion of this scale since 1939. From Belarus in the north, from Russia in the east, and from Crimea in the south, armored columns surged forward in a three-pronged assault designed to paralyze Ukraine's defenses before they could react. Soldiers painted the letters Z and V on their vehicles, symbols that would soon come to define the war's propaganda and brutality alike. Russian paratroopers stormed Hostomel Airport near Kiev, hoping to seize the runway and fly in thousands of reinforcements for a lightning strike on the capital. It was a plan modeled on speed, shock, and total psychological domination. But within hours, that plan began to unravel. Ukrainian air defenses, long dismissed as obsolete, shot down helicopters over the pine forests north of Kyiv. Anti-aircraft gunners at Vasilkiv Air Base scored kills on incoming cruise missiles. At Hostomel, a ragtag mix of National Guardsmen, police, and reservists fought the Russian elite to a standstill. The runway was cratered by Ukrainian artillery before transport planes could land. The air bridge collapsed, and Russian forces found themselves trapped behind enemy lines, cut off, surrounded, and bleeding. What was meant to be a swift decapitation strike became the first major defeat of the invasion's opening hours. In Kyiv, panic and resolve collided. Western intelligence agencies convinced the government would fall within days, offered President Volodymyr Zelensky evacuation. The offer was blunt: "We can get you out tonight." His reply was just as blunt and would echo around the world: "I need ammunition, not a ride." That defiance electrified the country. On social media, Zelensky appeared in a shaky handheld video outside his office, surrounded by his ministers in the cold night air. "The president is here. We are all here. We are defending our independence." In a war saturated by propaganda, it was a rare moment of truth. Ukraine would stand and fight. As Russian armor rolled toward Kyiv, ordinary citizens armed themselves with Molotov cocktails and hunting rifles. Volunteers flooded recruitment centers. Highway signs were taken down to confuse invaders. Farmers used tractors to tow away abandoned tanks. In Kharkiv, students filled sandbags while rockets slammed into apartment blocks. In Mariupol, families crowded basements as air raid sirens wailed. Every city became both fortress and target. The streets filled with the smell of diesel, smoke, and fear. But the spirit of collapse that Moscow expected never came. By the end of that first day, Russian troops had advanced deep into Ukrainian territory, but their lightning war had failed to strike decisive blows. Kyiv had not fallen. The Ukrainian command structure was intact. The nation's internet, powered by backup grids and satellite links, still pulsed with messages of resistance. Across the world, people watched the grainy videos, the missile trails, the burning convoys, the trembling voices from shelters, and understood that something unprecedented was unfolding. The era of assumed peace in Europe had ended, and the hour of darkness had arrived. By early March, Russia's dream of a 3-day victory had collapsed into a 64-kilometer traffic jam. The once terrifying convoy stretching from the Belarusian border to the outskirts of Kyiv became a steel monument to hubris. Satellite photos showed thousands of stalled vehicles, tanks, fuel trucks, troop carriers, clogged on narrow roads, frozen in place by mud, confusion, and Ukrainian ambushes. The Rasputitsa, the spring thaw that had once swallowed Napoleon's armies, was now devouring Putin's. Tires burst, engines overheated, and hungry soldiers scavenged abandoned villages for food. The army meant to take a capital was dying of logistics. Ukraine exploited the chaos with precision and fury. Special forces and small anti-armor teams hunted the convoy like wolves stalking a column of elephants. Moving through pine forests and back roads, they struck fuel tankers first, igniting fireballs that trapped entire battalions in smoke and flame. Bayraktar drones filmed the devastation from above, grainy cinematic proof that the invincible Russian army could burn like any other. On the Irpin River, Ukrainian engineers blew the last bridge to Kyiv, halting the advance, but also cutting off thousands of residents fleeing bombardment. The capital was now an island, surrounded but unbroken. Inside the city, the rhythm of life changed to the cadence of war. Air raid sirens became a daily soundtrack. Metro stations turned into bunkers packed with families sleeping shoulder to shoulder. Volunteers delivered soup to soldiers manning barricades of tires and tram rails. At night, Kyiv went dark, streetlights off, windows covered, the sky pierced only by tracer rounds and missile trails. Western media compared it to London in 1940, but Kyiv was fighting without an air force, relying instead on grit and Stinger missiles carried by civilians in bulletproof vests. The myth of Russian superiority was cracking under the weight of human resistance. In the suburbs, Busha, Irpin, Hostomel, the fighting was house to house. Russian artillery flattened apartment blocks, then infantry moved through the rubble, shooting at shadows. Ukrainian snipers and drones turned every street into a kill zone. Dozens of Russian generals were forced to command from the front because their radios failed, and many never made it back. The Kremlin's army, structured for parade grounds and intimidation, was disintegrating in the mud and blood of real combat. Yet, amid the wreckage, Moscow's cruelty intensified. Civilians were executed in courtyards, their hands bound. Women and children were found in shallow graves. Bucha would become synonymous not with battle, but with atrocity. By the end of March, the battle for Kyiv was over, not through negotiation, but through exhaustion and defeat. Russia's armored spearhead, mauled and starving, began to withdraw northward under constant fire. Moscow tried to spin the retreat as a gesture of goodwill, claiming it had achieved its goals. The truth was undeniable. The capital had survived, and the invasion's centerpiece had failed. For Ukraine, it was a moment of defiance etched into history. For Russia, it was the first hint of a much longer nightmare. The Blitzkrieg had turned into a war of attrition, and Kyiv still stood, scarred but alive. By the late summer of 2022, the front lines of Ukraine had ossified into a brutal stalemate. The Russian army still occupied vast swaths of the east and south, while Kyiv's forces, bloodied but hardened, dug in along a line that stretched hundreds of kilometers. Western analysts began to whisper that the war might freeze indefinitely. But behind the stillness, Ukraine was planning something extraordinary. Months of deception, disinformation, and discipline were converging into a single strike that would rewrite the course of the war. For weeks, the Ukrainian High Command and its Western partners staged a grand illusion. Publicly, they spoke only of an imminent southern counteroffensive toward Kherson, broadcasting their intentions across every channel. Kyiv moved troops south, struck bridges over the Dnipro River, and even leaked maps of supposed attack routes. The ruse worked perfectly. Russian commanders, panicked at the thought of losing their land bridge to Crimea, stripped the Kharkiv sector in the northeast of its best units, the paratroopers of the VDV and elite armor from the 1st Guards Tank Army, and redeployed them south. What remained in Kharkiv were undertrained conscripts, local militia, and terrified police. At dawn on September 6, 2022, the hammer fell where Russia least expected it. Ukrainian armored columns surged through the forests near Balaklia and Shevchenkov, supported by artillery that struck with surgical precision. These were not lumbering formations of Soviet-style tanks, but fast, coordinated mechanized units, light infantry mounted on Humvees, MRAPs, and captured Russian vehicles. They moved like lightning, slicing through the front before the enemy could react. Within hours, Ukrainian flags were flying over liberated villages. Russian units broke and fled, leaving behind crates of ammunition and entire arsenals of functioning armor. Panic spread faster than any bullet. Drone footage captured the surreal scenes of Russian soldiers abandoning their positions, throwing down weapons, even stealing civilian cars to escape. The mighty 1st Guards Tank Army, the pride of Moscow's military doctrine, disintegrated under the pressure, leaving behind so much equipment that Ukrainians joked they had received a new Lend-Lease program courtesy of Russia itself. In 6 days, Ukraine liberated over 3,000 square kilometers of territory, more ground than Russia had captured in the previous 5 months. The logistics hub of Kupiansk fell, severing the main supply artery to the entire Russian northern front. In liberated towns, people emerged from basements weeping, clutching soldiers in the blue and yellow patches as if embracing ghosts. Old women kissed the hands of liberators. Children waved paper flags drawn in crayon. Videos of these reunions flooded the internet, radiating a joy that momentarily pierced through the fog of war. For the first time since the invasion began, Ukraine was not just surviving, it was winning. The Kharkiv offensive was more than a tactical success. It was a psychological earthquake. It shattered the myth of Russian invincibility, proving that the Kremlin's army could be beaten, routed, and humiliated. In Moscow, state television stuttered in disbelief, then fell silent. The Kremlin's narrative of inevitable victory was gone, replaced by an unspoken fear that the empire was not only bleeding, but crumbling. And in Kyiv, as the autumn winds rolled in, hope returned. The thunder run of Kharkiv was not the end of the war, but it was the first glimpse that victory might no longer be an illusion. After the stunning success in Kharkiv, Ukraine turned its eyes south, to Kherson, the only regional capital Russia had captured since the start of the invasion. The city, perched on the western bank of the Dnipro River, was a strategic gem, a gateway to Crimea and a symbol of Putin's claim that Russia is here forever. But Kherson was also a trap. The Dnipro, wide as an inland sea, cut through the landscape like a natural fortress. To hold the city, Russian troops depended on a handful of bridges and ferries stretching across it, lifelines that Ukraine now aimed to cut, one by one. Through the summer and early autumn of 2022, the Ukrainian military unleashed a campaign of precision and patience. Using newly delivered HIMARS rocket systems, they struck not the Russian front line, but the arteries behind it: bridges, ammo dumps, command posts. Each explosion severed another vein in Russia's logistical body. The Antonivsky Bridge, once a gleaming Soviet structure, became a shattered carcass of twisted steel. Supply convoys were forced onto rickety pontoons or civilian ferries, easy prey for Ukrainian artillery. Every night, the sky over Kherson pulsed with red tracers and streaks of fire, as if the heavens themselves were tearing apart. For the civilians trapped inside the occupied city, life became unbearable. Russian soldiers looted homes, deported families, and flooded the streets with propaganda declaring that Kherson was eternally Russian. Yet behind the banners and staged referendums, fear gnawed at the occupiers. Ukrainian partisans, teachers by day, saboteurs by night, blew up patrols, poisoned collaborators, and passed coordinates to Kiev. Russian officers executed suspected informants in basements. Even as Moscow staged annexation ceremonies in the Kremlin, complete with champagne and patriotic choirs, the ground beneath their soldiers' boots in Kherson was collapsing. By early November, the situation for Russia had become unsustainable. Their lines were overextended, supplies dwindling, and retreat was the only way to avoid total encirclement. But retreating meant humiliation. The same Kremlin that had declared Kherson part of Russia could not admit defeat. For days, the propaganda machine insisted everything was under control, even as troops secretly prepared to abandon the city. Then, on November 9th, the order came down: withdraw across the Dnipro. In the dead of night, under the cover of rain and smoke, Russian columns slipped away, leaving mines, corpses, and shattered equipment behind. When Ukrainian troops entered Kherson on November 11th, the city exploded, not in shells, but in tears. Crowds poured into the streets waving blue and yellow flags that had been hidden for months in walls and attics. Soldiers were lifted onto shoulders, kissed, and smothered with flowers. Old men wept openly. Young women hugged the troops as church bells rang for the first time since the invasion. The footage went viral, a city reborn in the ruins, a nation that refused to surrender. For Russia, the retreat was catastrophic. It shattered the illusion of permanence and exposed the limits of Moscow's military machine. For Ukraine, Kherson was proof that patience, precision, and courage could reclaim what was lost. Yet the victory carried a grim truth. Across the river, Russian artillery still loomed, shelling the city almost daily. The Dnipro had become a new front, a shimmering, deadly divide between two worlds. And as winter set in, both sides dug deeper, preparing for a war that was far from over. The liberation of Kherson rekindled global hope that Ukraine might end the war on its own terms. But the winter that followed turned that hope into horror. The city of Bakhmut, a small industrial hub in the Donbass, became the stage for one of the most grotesque battles of the 21st century. Militarily, it held little strategic value. Symbolically, it became everything. For Moscow, capturing Bakhmut meant proving that Russia could still advance. For Kiev, holding it meant showing that Ukraine would never yield an inch. Between these two imperatives, tens of thousands of men would die for a city reduced to ash. Leading the Russian assault was not the regular army, but a mercenary empire, the Wagner Group. Its founder, Yevgeny Prigozhin, a former convict turned catering tycoon, transformed himself into Putin's warlord. Facing manpower shortages, he toured Russia's penal colonies, offering inmates a Faustian deal. 6 months at the front in exchange for freedom. Murderers, thieves, and addicts traded prison cells for rifles. They were thrown into battle as expendable waves, meat assaults, to expose Ukrainian positions for artillery to obliterate. Prisoners who refused to fight were executed on camera with sledgehammers. It was medieval cruelty reborn in the digital age. For the defenders, Bakhmut became a living nightmare. The city was shelled day and night until every building was a husk. Streets turned to trenches and basements to bunkers. The temperature plunged below freezing, and the air stank of cordite and decay. Ukrainian soldiers fought room to room, sometimes separated from Russian units by the width of a single wall. They rotated through the front in 30-day shifts, emerging half-mad and deaf from the constant bombardment. Hell is too kind a word, one survivor said later. Hell has rules. By March 2023, the Russians had surrounded Bakhmut from three sides, but Ukraine refused to abandon it. General Oleksandr Syrsky ordered fresh brigades into the grinder to bleed the enemy dry. Wagner's convicts advanced over the corpses of their comrades, sometimes in groups of 5 or 10, sometimes hundreds at once, only to be mowed down by machine gun fire. Drones filmed their bodies piling up in the snow, an apocalyptic tableau of a modern army collapsing into barbarism. Prigozhin mocked the regular Russian generals on social media, standing beside mountains of corpses and demanding more ammunition. His feud with the Ministry of Defense spilled into public spectacle, and for the first time since the war began, the cracks in the Kremlin's war machine were visible for all to see. When Wagner finally raised its flag over the ruins in May, the victory was hollow. The city was a graveyard. Neither side could hold it for long. Tens of thousands of Russian soldiers were dead or crippled, and Moscow's offensive momentum was spent. Ukraine had lost thousands too, but their sacrifice had drained Russia's elite assault units beyond repair. In the charred ruins of Bakhmut, one truth emerged. The Kremlin could still destroy, but it could no longer conquer. Yet even as the guns fell silent over the ruins, another storm brewed inside Russia itself. Prigozhin, drunk on blood and fame, turned his rage toward Moscow. The monster the Kremlin had created was about to march home. By the summer of 2023, Russia's war had begun to devour its own masters. The once invisible figure of Yevgeny Prigozhin, born in the shadows of Putin's inner circle, now roared against the Kremlin with the fury of a man betrayed. His Wagner mercenaries, bloodied from the inferno of Bakhmut, accused the Ministry of Defense of starvation, of denying them ammunition, air cover, and recognition. On June 23rd, the feud erupted into open rebellion. Columns of Wagner armored vehicles rolled north from Rostov-on-Don toward Moscow, shooting down Russian helicopters along the way. For 24 hours, the unthinkable happened. A private army was marching on the Russian capital. In Rostov, Wagner fighters seized the southern military district headquarters without firing a shot. Crowds filmed them posing beside tanks, laughing, smoking, waving to onlookers as if it were a parade. Prigozhin appeared on video, calling Russia's military leadership traitors, accusing them of lying about the war and sending tens of thousands to die for their vanity. The streets of Moscow filled with nervous police checkpoints, and Putin, visibly shaken, appeared on national television calling it a stab in the back. It was the first time in decades that his authority seemed mortal. Russia's nuclear-armed regime stood on the edge of chaos. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it ended. By the following day, the Wagner columns halted 200 kilometers from Moscow. A deal brokered by Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko offered Prigozhin exile and his men amnesty. The mutineers withdrew, engines rumbling south again, their rebellion dissolving like smoke. Yet the damage was irreversible. The illusion of Putin's control had been pierced, the myth of loyalty shattered. Within weeks, Wagner was disbanded, its fighters scattered to Africa, Belarus, or absorbed into the regular army. 2 months later, Prigozhin's jet exploded mid-air on its way to St. Petersburg. There were no survivors. The rebellion had been erased, but its echo lingered, whispering that even the Kremlin could bleed from within. On the front, the summer counteroffensive that Ukraine had spent months preparing was grinding forward through minefields the size of cities. Leopard tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles supplied by NATO led the charge across the open steppe of Zaporizhia, but Russia had fortified every meter with trenches, dragon's teeth, and artillery pre-sighted on every road. Progress was measured not in kilometers, but in meters. Soldiers called it the meat grinder reversed. This time, it was Ukraine bleeding against the wall. Drones buzzed overhead like insects, and the sky was alive with constant surveillance. The war had entered an era where machines watched every movement, and visibility meant death. By August, the Ukrainian advance had clawed back a few villages and breached the first of Russia's defensive lines, but the dreams of another Kharkiv-style breakthrough were gone. Exhaustion spread through both armies. Russia's conscripts dug in with fatalistic discipline, while Ukraine's soldiers fought with the grim realization that liberation would come slowly, if at all. The West's appetite for endless aid began to waver. Political debates replaced moral clarity. Yet beneath the stalemate, a quieter revolution was underway, one that would redefine the battlefield itself. As the autumn rains approached, the skies over Ukraine filled with the sound of engines, not from aircraft, but from drones. Thousands of them, cheap, lethal, and unstoppable. The next phase of the war would not be defined by tanks or artillery, but by the whine of propellers and the flicker of distant explosions. The drone age had begun. By 2024, the face of war in Ukraine had changed beyond recognition. The age of tank duels and grand offensives gave way to something quieter, smaller, and infinitely deadlier. The new soldiers were not always men. They were machines, piloted by unseen hands miles away. Cheap FPV drones built from off-the-shelf parts and guided through video goggles became the new artillery. A $500 quadcopter could now destroy a $4 million tank. The battlefield had turned into a chessboard of buzzing death, where every movement was visible, and every hesitation meant annihilation. In this new order, ingenuity replaced firepower. Ukrainian drone units, some little more than garage workshops, became legends. They named their machines after folklore demons and heavy metal bands, painting skulls on their frames, wiring RPG warheads to plastic fuselages. Russian trenches that once held strong against mortars and tanks were now death traps. A single drone could slip through a window, hover for a second, and detonate in a room full of soldiers. The psychological toll was devastating. Sleep became impossible when death could arrive through the roof at any hour of night. Soldiers on both sides began covering their foxholes with metal cages, burying themselves beneath layers of wire and jammers, but the swarm always found a gap. The air was alive with improvisation. Russia answered with its own wave of Shahed 136 drones from Iran, cheap, loud, terrifying machines that cruised low over Ukrainian cities, guided by GPS and vengeance. They came in packs of 20 or 30, engines sputtering like chainsaws, striking power plants and apartment blocks alike. Air defense sirens howled nightly, children slept in basements, and surgeons operated by flashlight. Yet for every drone Russia sent, Ukraine built two. The war had turned asymmetric in a new, brutal way. Not about who had more tanks, but who had more circuit boards, more batteries, more imagination. At sea, the balance of power shifted even more dramatically. Ukraine, a nation that had lost almost its entire navy in 2014, reinvented maritime warfare with the same garage-born ingenuity that powered its drones. The Sea Baby and Magura V5, uncrewed surface vessels guided remotely from hundreds of kilometers away, became the wolves of the Black Sea. They skimmed the waves at night, silent and low, each carrying nearly a ton of explosives. The mighty Black Sea Fleet, once the pride of Russian imperial history, began dying ship by ship. The landing ship Olenigorsky Gornyak, the corvette Ivanovets, and the patrol vessel Sergei Kotov all vanished beneath the surface in spectacular fireballs captured by the very cameras mounted on the drones that killed them. By autumn 2024, satellite images revealed what few could believe. The Russian Navy had fled Sevastopol, abandoning Crimea's once untouchable naval bastion. Warships now hid hundreds of miles away in Novorossiysk behind nets, barges, and decoys. The Black Sea, long thought to be Russia's private lake, had become a hunting ground controlled by a country with no navy at all. Through these waters, Ukraine quietly reopened its grain corridor, defying Moscow's blockade and restoring exports that fed millions across Africa and the Middle East. For the first time since the invasion began, Ukraine had turned the tables, winning not through numbers or alliances, but through invention. The world watched in astonishment. A nation fighting for survival had rewritten the rules of modern warfare. The drone revolution was no longer a sideshow. It was the new doctrine. Every army on Earth took notice, from Washington to Beijing. The war that had begun with tanks now belonged to tablets, antennas, and operators hidden in ruined churches. The future of conflict had arrived, and it was buzzing. By 2025, the war had devoured its illusions. What began as a clash of armies had hardened into a test of civilizations, a contest not for land, but for endurance. The front lines barely moved anymore. From Kupiansk to Robotyne, the Earth was scarred with trenches visible from orbit, each crater overlapping the last. Soldiers rotated through the same dugouts their predecessors had died in months before, fighting over villages that no longer existed. It was no longer a war of maneuvers, but of metabolism. Who could keep the factories running? Who could feed the cannons longer? Inside Russia, the economy became a war machine. The Kremlin called it mobilization of industry, but it was closer to organized desperation. Civilian factories were seized and converted to produce shells, uniforms, and drones. Car manufacturers now built armored vehicles. Refrigerator plants churned out missile casings. The economy appeared to grow, but only on paper, an illusion inflated by state contracts and propaganda. With hundreds of thousands dead or exiled, labor shortages became chronic. Women replaced men in foundries, prisoners replaced engineers, and wages tripled only to buy the same bread. Moscow's answer to every problem was the same: print more rubles and silence those who complained. To sustain this illusion, Putin turned east. North Korean ships docked in Russian ports, offloading millions of artillery shells, some functional, others decades old. Iranian cargo planes landed weekly with crates of Shahed drones, while Russia sent back gold, oil, and secrecy. Even China, while careful to avoid Western sanctions, supplied the microchips and optics that kept Russia's war engine from seizing. It was an alliance of isolation, a global economy of pariahs trading in ammunition and lies. The Kremlin called it resilience. Historians would call it regression. Ukraine, meanwhile, faced a different kind of exhaustion, one measured in hearts, not hardware. The early euphoria of defiance had faded into a dull ache of loss. The front demanded men faster than the nation could replace them. The average Ukrainian soldier was now over 40, many fighting alongside their sons. Mobilization officers became objects of dread, dragging reluctant recruits from buses, gyms, and factories. Social media filled with videos of families pleading for mercy, of widows holding photos of men who would never return. A generation was being erased in real time, and yet the country fought on, not because it wanted to, but because it could not afford to stop. Western aid still flowed, but slower, more conditional, entangled in political fatigue. The promised F-16s were delayed, the ammunition shipments rationed. In Washington and Brussels, debates over war fatigue replaced talk of victory. Yet in Kyiv, candlelit apartments and generator hums became symbols of endurance. The people had adapted to darkness, cold, and grief. Teachers held classes in subway stations. Musicians played in bomb shelters. "We are tired," one Kyiv resident said in an interview. "But we are not finished." By the spring of 2025, neither side could win, yet neither could quit. The war had become a permanent state of being, a grinding, mechanical cycle of destruction that consumed everything except resolve. On the battlefield, soldiers began riding into combat on dirt bikes and Chinese golf carts, racing through minefields to deliver grenades before the drones found them. It was absurd, almost primitive, a 21st century war regressing into chaos. But beneath the madness, a grim truth remained. The side that could suffer longer would decide the future of Europe, and suffering was the one resource neither nation had yet exhausted. 11 years after the first little green men appeared in Crimea, the war that was meant to last 3 days had redrawn the moral and political map of the world. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, conceived as a lightning strike to restore an empire, had become a slow, corrosive burn consuming the empire itself. The front lines in 2025 were not just physical trenches, they were ideological divides running through continents and consciences alike. The conflict had become the defining struggle of a generation, the moment when Europe remembered that peace, like freedom, is never permanent. For Russia, the dream of restoration curdled into self-destruction. Vladimir Putin had begun his war to halt NATO's expansion. He ended up doubling its borders. Finland and Sweden joined the alliance, transforming the Baltic Sea into a NATO fortress. The Black Sea Fleet hid in exile, and the once mighty Russian army had been reduced to a patchwork of conscripts, convicts, and mercenaries. The Russian world he promised to unify was obliterated, its cities flattened by his own artillery, its language forever tainted by the echoes of air raids. Russia had gained land but lost its soul. For Ukraine, the price of survival was unimaginable. Entire cities like Mariupol and Severodonetsk ceased to exist. Generations were shattered, families scattered across continents. A nation of 40 million was carved down by exile, death, and displacement. Yet what remained was indestructible. Ukraine's identity, once divided between East and West, had been reforged in blood. The idea of being Ukrainian no longer depended on language, geography, or politics. It was defined by endurance. "We have been through hell," a soldier at the front once said, "and we came out Ukrainian." Beyond the battlefield, the war reshaped the 21st century. It exposed the fragility of globalization, the empty warehouses, the hollow defense stockpiles, the comfortable myths of post-war Europe. It revealed that in an age of drones and data, courage still mattered, and that the will of ordinary people could stall a superpower. The new Iron Curtain was not made of concrete, but of sanctions, firewalls, and autonomous machines. The Cold War had returned, but this time it was colder, quieter, and digital. As 2025 drew to a close, there was no peace treaty, no victory parade, only exhaustion and memory. The guns still thundered in the Donbass, and the dead still outnumbered the living in some villages. But Ukraine remained, against logic, against scale, against history itself. It remained. Its cities glowed faintly through the blackout, and its flag, blue and yellow, still flew over Kyiv. History does not always end in triumph or tragedy. Sometimes it ends in survival. And in that survival lies defiance. The story of Russia's invasion of Ukraine is not just about power. It is about endurance, about a small nation's refusal to disappear, about the moment when the world was reminded that courage is not measured in victories, but in persistence. History doesn't end. It only changes the faces of those who endure it.